July 2021 marks the fifth anniversary of the Permanent Court of Arbitration Award defending the Philippines lawsuit against China over the South China Sea dispute. U.S. Vietnam review the U.S. Journal affiliated with the University of Oregon interview with Dr. Derek Grossman, senior defense analyst at the RAND Corporation, about the South China Sea dispute. This interview focuses on Vietnam military capability, prospects of the relation between Vietnam and the United States and China, future strategies for the South China Sea. Thank you, Dr. Derek Grossman, so much for giving us this interview.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. In the first section, we would like to ask you is the problem of U.S. and China in Vietnamese views. In the report, regional responses to U.S.-China competition in Indo-Pacific, Yuan said that U.S. may have a slight advantage on political and diplomatic side.
Yeah, and I think you're referring to the RAND report that that I wrote last year as part of a series of reports looking at regional responses to U.S.-China competition, and I was the author of the Vietnam report in that series. And so let me just take a step back briefly and explain what we did. So we had a methodology in place to measure relative influence between the U.S. and China as they compete in a range of different countries, most of which were in Southeast Asia, but some were also in Northeast Asia and South Asia. And the methodology we used had three different components: diplomatic, economic, and security. And the question you're asking is about the U.S. having a slight edge diplomatically. And so we incorporated both quantitative and qualitative data into our analysis for each of those three components. And what I found on the diplomatic side was that the US and Vietnam tended to share a common worldview, which is that they both want to live in a rules-based order. And of course, the one that does not really want to live as much in a rules-based order is China. And that comes to a head in the South China Sea. China's perspective is that the 9-dash line is based on historical territorial rights. Vietnam's perspective is that is one of the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, right? In which disputes need to be settled peacefully and through a legal process. And so Vietnam has increasingly turned to the U.S. as a like-minded partner in that regard. And so that's why I said that at least there's a slight advantage the U.S. has in the diplomatic factor. But we also, of course, have to keep in mind that Vietnam and China have a long-standing relationships, especially between the two communist parties, the Vietnamese Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party, that has been born out of years and years of opposing colonialism and imperialism. Ho Chi Minh, the founder of socialist Vietnam, also, was in close contact with the Chinese Communist Party from very early on, and so that is something that we had to kind of take into account. But increasingly, China's worldview is very different than Vietnam's, and that was the main thrust for why we said that the U.S. has a slight advantage. There are other factors as well. One of which, one of the sub factors within that diplomatic factor was public opinion. And as I'm sure you know, public opinion in Vietnam of China is extremely low. Nobody knows quite the percentage, but it's maybe somewhere in the area of 90% of Vietnamese polled have a dislike for China at a minimum, and maybe even a hatred of China. And when you look at the flip side for the United States, the Vietnamese population is overwhelmingly pro-US. So that also factored into the US having that slight diplomatic advantage.
Yeah, I see. Thank you. And you once pointed out that Vietnam worries that Cambodia and Laos are becoming increasingly beholden to China. And in fact, eroding Vietnam's special relationship with its two nations in Indochina. So the United States should show the commitment to compete with the BRI, the One Belt One Road strategies, Chinese One Belt One Road strategies to have Vietnam avoid encirclement by pro-China countries. So
yeah, go ahead.
Yes, and I just want to ask, would you would you please explain Vietnamese view about Chinese BRI strategies? Because you know, does Vietnam see the BRI as an opportunity instead of threat? So Vietnam, you know, 2 years ago, Vietnam proposed the draft law on special economic zones, and this law allowing foreigners to lease land for 99 years in 3 areas, including Vân Đồn, an economic zone adjacent to Chinese border. Besides this law, this draft law waives visas for Chinese citizens who enter Vietnam via Vân Đồn. So does Vietnam aim to take advantage of opportunities from the Chinese One Belt One Road strategies instead considering it as just a threat?
Yeah, Vietnam is in a really tough spot when it comes to China's BRI. And so my understanding is Vietnam would rather not be involved in BRI because they simply do not trust China's plans and intentions with that massive infrastructure and investment program, as you mentioned, with Cambodia and also with Laos. The Vietnamese look across their border and they see that the Chinese come in with their own workers. They build up these infrastructure projects, sometimes in sensitive areas, whether environmentally or militarily, and then they wind up staying and not and building Chinatowns within these sovereign countries. And the idea, at least from what I've heard from Vietnamese who are expert on this issue, is that Hanoi has no intention of putting itself in that type of predicament. The Chinese want to build the north-south highway in Vietnam. Some of that highway would go through sensitive areas for Vietnam. Some of them are sensitive military sites. And former generals, I think maybe current generals as well in the Vietnamese People's Army, had come out publicly and said it's a bad idea because it gives the Chinese too much information. There's a lot of other factors involved here as well. You mentioned the special economic zone draft law in 2018. That resulted in nationwide protests for weeks and weeks, and eventually the Communist Party had to withdraw that draft legislation, and it has not reappeared. And I don't think that that's a coincidence, because going back to what I said earlier, the Vietnamese population is at a minimum extremely suspicious of Chinese intentions, and at a maximum really is very sort of frustrated with China and kind of angry at China in some ways, and maybe some even hate China. And so I think BRI is one of those things that kind of brings out those feelings, right? That China is trying to take over Vietnam's economy, maybe even secretly. Too many jobs are going to China, not enough to Vietnam, not enough products are made in Vietnam. The level of corruption that BRI brings. I mean, when I went to Vietnam to conduct the research, one of the folks I spoke to said that Vietnam doesn't even know how many BRI projects actually exist in Vietnam, because a lot of them pre-existed before Xi Jinping, And of course, BRI is Xi Jinping's hallmark economic program. And so now, and a lot of them have now been repackaged to become BRI. So Hanoi is doing an active investigation to determine which projects now count as BRI. The only official BRI project in Vietnam, as I'm sure you know, is the Hanoi metro system. And it's massively over budgeted and delayed. And when you look at the counterpart in Ho Chi Minh City, that's being built by the Japanese, the Ho Chi Minh City metro system there, it is over budget, it is delayed, but not as over budgeted and delayed as the Chinese. And the Chinese have had safety concern issues with in testing some of their rail cars. So that is kind of like the poster child for the Vietnamese of why you cannot trust. One of the reasons why you cannot trust BRI, because it's inefficient, it's even maybe dangerous. And there's all these other reasons that I mentioned as well about sensitivity of sites and maybe giving the Chinese the keys to the palace unwittingly.
Thank you. Do you think that there is a different views between the government leader, the Vietnam Communist Party leaders, and the views of Vietnamese intellectual, Vietnamese civil society over China? So you mentioned about the hating sentiment of Vietnamese civic society over China, but do you think that Vietnamese leader also hold that sentiment, or they see the Chinese One Belt One Road as both an opportunity and a threat, and opportunities have more prominent and the risk just insignificant. So if the leader, Vietnamese leader, not Vietnamese civic society, Vietnamese leader, the Communist Party's leaders think that, so would they want to join hands with the US to contend the BRI?
Yeah. So going back to the responses to regional competition report on Vietnam. So we covered the diplomatic. US had a slight advantage. In the economic factor, China had an overwhelming advantage, and most of this is due to BRI. But it even, I'm sure, predates BRI because China is the partner right next door with the massive economy, right? And so I think a lot of Vietnamese are worried about that, as I said. Now, when it comes to the leadership aspect of it, the Vietnamese Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party, again, have a very long-standing close partnership. I don't think the US would ever be able to kind of split that bond, and nor does the US seek to, but suffice it to say that that's a long-standing, very close relationship that I think benefits Vietnam quite a bit because they get a lot of insights as to what China is up to by talking to them constantly. And also, frankly, the Vietnamese have adopted some Chinese aspects of society. Some would say many more than some, the majority of what they're doing. And there's lots of examples of this. I mean, the SEZ law that we were just talking about, SEZs came from China, right? The idea of doi moi in 1986, I think harkens back to Gai Ge Kai Feng, right, in 1978, when the Chinese reformed and opened up their economy to the West and to the world to become more capitalistic. The cybersecurity law in Vietnam is essentially verbatim what the Chinese cybersecurity law says. Right now, with all of that in mind, I'm a China analyst at heart, okay? We always say when we analyze China that China, when they adopt things from the outside, they do so with Chinese characteristics. So they always kind of repackage whatever it is they're adopting to fit China, okay? I would argue that the Vietnamese adopt Chinese concepts with Vietnamese characteristics, that it's never quite wholesale, nor should it be. I mean, every country kind of makes its own decisions, but especially when adopting concepts from your adversary, all right, up north, there is, I think, a certain hesitancy to go too far. So, for example, with the cybersecurity law, yes, it's verbatim, but Vietnam is not putting into place a great firewall in the way China is. Some in the party, in the Vietnamese Communist Party, might want to do that, but I think most of them figure that you can't stop Facebook in Vietnam, you can't stop Twitter. You're just going to cause outrage, and it's going to cause more problems for Vietnam. So in the end, it's sort of a cybersecurity law light, LITE. But you know, there is that kind of interesting dynamic going on. So to answer your question, I mean, I think the leadership is very close to the Chinese leadership, but the people are much more distant. And what's interesting is the military is caught in the middle, right? Because the military in Vietnam is beloved by the people, and they're very suspicious of China, but they also answer to the party. So, you know, that'll be a very kind of important and interesting dynamic that plays out over time. And one other thing, you mentioned civil society. It depends who you talk to, right? I mean, some of the older folk that I've talked to in Vietnam, they are kind of more suspicious of the United States because they lived through the Vietnam War. And that's, you know, China actually helped Vietnam, of course, against the United States during that war. But then when you talk to folks that are kind of middle age, and especially the younger crowd, they usually can speak some English, right? And or they're fluent, and they have a very kind of friendly view of the United States and a much more distrustful view of China. So there's a generational kind of spectrum as well to keep in mind.
I see. I see. So, do you think on on the U.S. Vietnam relation and on in terms of how Vietnam see how Vietnam look at the U.S. Do you think political system and ideology are an insurmountable barrier between American between the U.S. and Vietnam? Vietnam, you know, has accepted the market economy more than 40 years since more than 40 years, but Vietnam still teach communism in army, in police, and university, high school, and the political system of Vietnam is still communist system. So Vietnam Communist Party still considers the United States dangerous to its power, and still believe those who oppose the communism and the dictatorship as ideological enemies. So from the perspective of ideology and political regime, do you think the US or the China win the trust of Hanoi government?
Yeah, so no, it's a really kind of fundamental question,
Yeah.
that I think kind of looms over the US Vietnam
Mm.
comprehensive partnership, which is, can the US and Vietnam continue their relationship when Vietnam is authoritarian and a socialist country ruled by a communist party, and the United States is a democratic system and capitalist system, right? I mean, can those things continue to sort of coexist, right? And I think the U.S. and Vietnam have done a pretty good job of papering over their differences. I would highlight that the only Vietnamese general Communist Party general secretary visit to the White House to happen was in July of 2015 during the Obama administration. And how was that facilitated? It's very important to kind of understand this, because I don't think it's very well understood, frankly, in this community of people who watch it, who watch these issues. That was facilitated because the Obama administration recognized and respected Vietnam's form of political governance. And that has served as the cornerstone of the relationship that we see today. Yes, relations were normalized in 1995, but things didn't really start to take off until right around 2015. So it's still new. It's only 6 years ago, right? And what we saw with the Trump administration, and now we're seeing with the Biden administration, is a reaffirmation of the fact that the United States recognizes the legitimacy of, and respects the Vietnamese political system. Without that, there can really be no progress in the relationship. Now, China will easily say, yeah, the United States says that, but they're really trying to, um, you know, forge a closer economic relationship with you in order to insert a Trojan horse that's eventually going to democratize Vietnam. And then the Communist Party is going to lose control. And you guys are all going to be really unhappy about that. And it's not going to be good for you. And it's not going to be good for us. Right. And there are, especially older folks in the Vietnamese system who lived through, the Vietnam War, who still believe in this idea of peaceful evolution. And it's exactly what I just said, that the US will try to somehow, through increased interactions, basically kind of influence the younger generation to overthrow the government. That is going to be really tough to get over. And it's not just the political governance or ideological issues at play, it's also human rights, right? So the Trump administration was very selective in how it talked about human rights. Anything to do with China and human rights, bad, right? Vietnam and others, we're not going to talk about as much. It was selective. The Biden administration is not as selective and seems to be much more, willing to criticize even countries that it wants to become closer with on human rights. Okay. So, I think that could raise some problems. Now, what we saw with the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin's visit to Vietnam in the last few days, is that topic, if it was broached, it was privately done. It was not publicly discussed. Okay. But Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman's visit to Cambodia, Indonesia, and Thailand in late May, early June, she did talk about it, and she talked about it very publicly. So I've been writing about this quite a bit. I mean, there's sort of this tension there always is, but especially in the Biden administration, there's this ongoing tension between emphasizing or prioritizing shared values versus shared interests. The interests are clear: extreme competition with China, counter China at every turn. The shared values part is we want to work with democracies to get this done through the Quad, Australia, Japan, India, and the United States, right? Through those types of mechanisms. I just saw before we got on that President Biden is going to make good on holding a summit for democracy sometime in December. All right. Do you think Vietnam's going to be invited to that? No. Right. So that's going to rub Vietnam the wrong way. It just is. Right. So there are kind of inherent problems that can only be resolved by reaffirming that political foundational point, and also people-to-people ties. I mean, the Secretary of Defense's visit, I thought, hit all the right notes in terms of, talking about legacy of war issues, helping Vietnam find its own war dead, continuing the Agent Orange detoxification efforts. All of those things I think are really important, and in fact are probably more important to Vietnam than dealing with the South China Sea, which is more kind of a U.S. issue. I mean, yes, Vietnam, don't get me wrong, Vietnam's concerned about it, but there's other things too that are on Vietnam's plate that are kind of at an equal level. And so it was really important, I think, for the US to kind of air that out. Look at what Secretary of State Tony Blinken is doing as we speak. He's meeting with ASEAN, and 2 out of the 5 meetings for this week with ASEAN are about the Mekong River. Again, existential issue for Vietnam, ensuring that Chinese damming upstream does not impact Vietnam's rice paddies in the lower Mekong, which serves as the bulk of Vietnam's food source. All right, so it's really important to see that those other things kind of getting a little bit of spotlight in the relationship. And I think that'll improve U.S.-Vietnam ties over the long run.
Yeah. So can you explain Can you explain more in detail about the Vietnamese position in the U.S. chessboard in Asia?
The U.S. position in Asia?
Yeah, no. The Vietnamese position in the U.S. in the U.S. strategy
Oh,
in Asia.
yeah. So the hard part about that is we don't have an Indo-Pacific strategy for the Biden administration, right? And frankly, we are a ways away from that. I mean, we don't even have a national security strategy yet. The way it usually works is you first have a national security strategy, then you have a national defense strategy, and then you have an Indo-Pacific strategy. So we could be many, many months away, maybe even a year away from an Indo-Pacific strategy for the Biden administration. What we do have, however, is an interim national security strategic guidance document that was published by the Biden administration in March. So this was kind of like, let us give you a sense of what our strategy is going to be without actually telling you everything about our strategy because we don't know yet. And in that interim guidance document, Vietnam is spotlighted as a very important partner. So is Singapore. So Vietnam and Singapore in Southeast Asia are really kind of almost at the table. And that I think was reflected by the Secretary of Defense's choices for visits in Southeast Asia. It was Singapore, it was Vietnam, and then Philippines. There's another reason for that, which is to get the visiting forces agreement to stay intact under the Duterte government, right? So that was sort of a special case, but no other Southeast Asian countries, including our allies, including the Philippines and Thailand were mentioned by name in that document, except for Vietnam and Singapore. So I think Vietnam holds a very important place in the U.S.'s kind of emerging Indo-Pacific strategy, and that's here to stay. I don't see that going anywhere. ... Unless the Biden administration decides to really amp up the pressure on human rights. I don't see that happening right now because I see and this kind of gets into a longer discussion, but basically a massaging of the message so that, the Biden administration is not just talking about human rights and kind of blowing up all the other potential areas of cooperation, but a more kind of or carefully choreographed way of bringing it up, whether in private or through different statements that kind of bring it up, but not make it the priority of the relationship. So I think that's probably going to remain the key to continuing what we see as some pretty good momentum in U.S.-Vietnam relations.
So if the U.S. want to strengthen cooperation with Vietnam to contain China, so how will the U.S. handle the human rights issue in Vietnam?
Yeah, no, I mean, well, like I was saying, I mean, I think that it is going to be much more kind of choreographed and handled in a more discreet way going forward. I think that the Wendy Sherman visit to Cambodia, Indonesia, and Thailand, the responses from those countries was not particularly positive because they feel like they're being lectured to on human rights. So last thing, so what we saw, and this was the point I wanted to bring up earlier, when Secretary Blinken visited India last week, it was very interesting what happened. India, yes, it is a democracy, but it is an increasingly illiberal democracy under Prime Minister Narendra Modi. They do not treat minorities, primarily Muslims, well in India, and it's become a real issue. We had the Pegasus scandal the other day, which exposed that the Indian government was spying on journalists and all kinds of different people, right? So there's concerns in Washington that India is not quite the free and liberal society that it once was. So when Blinken went there, he said, we are going to talk about democracy. We are going to talk about human rights, but we're going to do it from a position, we, the United States, are going to do it from a position of humility. He actually used that word, humility, right? We are not a perfect democratic system. and we are not professing to be one. We have flaws. We're trying to fix those flaws. We want to have a genuine, frank conversation with our allies and partners about becoming better democracies. So, and we saw this with Secretary Austin's visit as well when he went to Singapore and talked about shared values. He said we are also looking for to become a more perfect union. So that's the type of repackaging that I'm talking about. When it comes to Vietnam, of course, Vietnam is not a democracy. So I think that talking about democracy is probably not what's going to happen, but human rights inevitably is going to come up, but it will be done in a similarly massaged manner to talking about democratic issues.
Yeah, thank you. So we talk about how Vietnam look at the U.S., how Vietnam see China, so and how the U.S. see Vietnam. So the last section we talk about how I want to ask you about how China view Vietnam. Absolutely, China is critical to Vietnam politically and economically, but how is Vietnam important to China?
Well, I mean, yeah. So Vietnam.
And one more and more. How's Vietnam important to China? And China repeatedly advised Vietnam to protect pluralism, namely to protect the communist political regime. So, in your opinion, even though the possibility of Vietnam democratization is very low, but will Vietnam accept Vietnam democratization?
Yeah, I mean, I think China certainly does not want to see Vietnam become a democratic country because it's right at China's doorstep in their backyard. But I mean, I did a study recently that was published for Asia Policy. That's the National Bureau of Asian Research's journal, Asia Policy, that tracked Chinese views of U.S. Vietnam cooperation over time. And frankly, if you go back to even 1995 to up until today, China doesn't think that the US has moved the needle all that much with Vietnam. And that's because Vietnam shares that ideology, that socialist ideology with China. And China has not seen that budge whatsoever. And, for China, ensuring that Vietnam does not become a democracy, I think, is really a very important deal. But if the U.S. and Vietnam were to increase their security cooperation, even to the level of strategic partnership, so beyond the current comprehensive partnership to a strategic partnership, which might involve additional exercises, could involve even Vietnam becoming some sort of dialogue partner with the Quad. I still don't think China is going to be fazed by that, because at the end of the day, China is viewing its dispute with Vietnam to be really related to South China Sea and to potentially the border dispute, which they've always handled internally with Vietnam. It's hard to know what would sort of be the red line for Beijing. But I will tell you that in the last 25 years, 26 years, Vietnam has not crossed that red line, and it doesn't seem like it's going to. And in fact, when you look at the 3 no's defense policy, which is now the 4 no's and 1 depends policy, it was forged back it made its first appearance in Vietnam's defense white paper in 1998. And what I've heard is that it actually was a concession to China. It was Vietnam voicing the idea that these are the 3 things that we will not do. So no alliances, no foreign military bases, and no aligning with a second country against a third, parenthetically you. We won't do any of those 3 things, right, in order to maintain China-Vietnam relations. That's what I've heard. I don't know if it's true. but it wouldn't surprise me. And so as long as that defense, so assuming that's true, as long as that defense policy stays in place, then I think China is going to feel very confident about itself. But with that, I am going to have to jump off, unfortunately. So maybe if you wanted to conclude, we can do that.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Derek Grossman, for sharing your analysis with us.